All right, so you know how it is with these Proxmox servers, right? You're going
Mhm.
along, everything's running great, and then bam, you hit that storage limit.
Yeah, you just run out of space.
And it's the worst feeling ever.
It's a huge pain. It really is.
And today we're going to deep dive into a guide about migrating your Proxmox server to a larger SSD.
Without any downtime, ideally.
Ideally without any downtime, that's the goal.
Yeah,
We want to keep everything running smoothly.
right, exactly.
So we've got some great source material here that goes into a few different approaches and tricks of the trade to make this process as painless as possible.
Yeah, because let's face it, migrating a whole server sounds scary.
Sounds terrifying.
But it's really not as bad as you think.
It's not as bad as you think if you're careful and you follow the steps.
Exactly.
So we're going to walk you through the key options,
Yeah.
introduce you to some tools, and share some expert tips
Favorite tips?
to give you the confidence to tackle this migration head on.
Right.
So the first option we're going to talk about is the backup and restore method,
Yeah.
which is kind of like the classic safe bet.
This is the tried and true way to do it.
Yeah.
It's reliable and it gives you that peace of mind that you've got a fallback option.
Like a safety net.
Exactly.
So basically, you're backing up everything on your current Proxmox server, and then you install a fresh Proxmox installation on your new, larger SSD.
Right.
And then once that's all up and running, you just restore from your backup.
It's really that simple.
So it's like hitting the reset button, but with all your data intact.
Exactly. And that's why it's so safe.
And you're also starting fresh, so you're eliminating any risk of weird resizing issues.
Right. All those problems you can get when you try to expand partitions on a live system.
Yeah, you don't want to mess with that.
It's much safer to just start fresh.
So now Proxmox has a few built-in tools for backups, right?
Yeah, Proxmox has got you covered there.
So what are our options there?
Well, you can use snapshots, which are quick saves of your system.
Okay.
They're great for incremental backups, so you can roll back to different points in time.
Yeah.
You can also do full backups to external drives, like a USB drive or a NAS device.
Okay, yeah.
That stands for network attached storage.
That's a good point, because I always forget what NAS stands for.
Yeah, it's easy to forget.
And then there's also Proxmox Backup Server. Right?
Yeah, that's the big one.
The big leagues.
Proxmox Backup Server is a dedicated solution that's just for backing up your Proxmox environment.
Oh, wow.
And it offers some really cool features like continuous backup.
Ooh, continuous backup. What is that?
That means it's constantly backing up your data in the background incrementally.
So it's always saving.
Yeah, pretty much. You always have a very up-to-date backup ready to go.
Oh, wow. So you never have to worry about losing anything.
Exactly. It's great for peace of mind.
That sounds amazing.
It is pretty cool.
We'll definitely have to include some links in the show notes for those who want to explore Proxmox Backup Server more in detail.
Definitely.
But let's get back to the backup and restore method itself.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing one of the biggest benefits here is that you have that old SSD as a fallback if something goes wrong during the migration.
Exactly. It's like an insurance policy for your data.
That's a great way to put it.
That peace of mind is priceless.
It really is.
But let's say you want a faster method.
Okay.
You spend a lot of time customizing your Proxmox setup and you don't want to start from scratch.
I could see that.
That's where cloning comes in.
Cloning, it sounds so sci-fi.
I know, right?
Like we're making copies of ourselves.
It's not quite that advanced, but it does involve creating an exact copy of your old SSD onto your new, larger one.
So basically duplicating the entire drive.
Yep, that's it.
What tools do we need for that?
The go-to tool is Clonezilla.
Clonezilla.
It's open source, and it's perfect for disk cloning tasks.
Okay.
It copies everything, all your partitions data, the whole shebang.
The whole 9 yards.
Exactly. But once the cloning is done, you'll also need to resize the partitions on the new SSD.
Right, because otherwise the system would know it has all that extra space.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what do we use for that?
Gparted is a good tool for that.
Gparted.
It's a free partition editor, and you can resize the file system on your new SSD.
Okay.
So Proxmox can use all of that lovely new storage.
So we're talking about booting from a Clonezilla live USB to clone the drive, and then booting from a Gparted live USB to resize.
Right.
It's pretty techy.
It is a bit, yeah.
I feel like we're hacking the mainframe or something.
Uh-huh. I know what you mean.
But I imagine there's a bit more risk involved with this method compared to the backup and restore.
Yeah, you're right to be cautious because you're directly manipulating the drive structure.
Right.
There's always a chance of data corruption if something goes wrong.
So backups are essential.
Absolutely essential with this method.
Okay, good to know. And would you say it's safer to do this cloning process on a separate machine if possible?
If you have that option, it definitely reduces the risk.
Okay.
It's like having a safety net.
A backup for your backup.
Exactly.
But let's say you have a Proxmox server with multiple SSD slots. and you just want to add more storage capacity.
All right.
You can just add the new SSD as additional storage.
That's the easiest option if you have the hardware for it.
So no need to mess with backups or cloning at all?
Nope, you're just adding more space to the system.
That's so much easier.
It is much simpler.
So how does that work?
Well, you physically install the new SSD in your server,
Okay.
and then you go to the Proxmox web interface, and you add the new SSD as a storage option,
Okay.
and then format it correctly.
Okay, so pretty straightforward so far.
And then you can start transferring your virtual machines to the new drive.
Okay, and how do we go about moving those VMs?
Proxmox has a command for this. It's called qm-move.
QM move.
Yeah, and you use that to tell Proxmox where you want to move the VMs.
Okay, so it's not a drag and drop kind of thing.
Not quite, but it's not super complicated either.
Okay.
The Proxmox documentation walks you through it step by step.
That's good. And here's the really cool part. You can use this QM move command to migrate your virtual machines without powering them down.
That's a huge time saver.
Right, that minimizes downtime, which is always what we want.
Exactly.
So with this option, we're basically using the original SSD as the main system drive.
Right.
And the new SSD just becomes dedicated storage for our VMs.
That's right. And the best part is you can repurpose the original SSD for things like storing ISO files,
Oh, okay.
which are used for installing new virtual machines or even VM templates.
So you're saying we don't have to just leave that original drive sitting there doing nothing.
Exactly. You can give it a new purpose.
I like that.
It's all about optimizing.
So, okay, we've covered 3 distinct options for migrating your Proxmox server to a larger SSD.
3 good options.
Before we move on, do you have any expert tips for our listeners who might be considering one of these migration methods?
Definitely the most important thing is to test.
Test.
Before you migrate your entire Proxmox server, try it out on a non-essential virtual machine.
Oh, that's smart.
It's like a dress rehearsal, you know.
Yeah.
It helps you avoid any major surprises.
So much better to catch those issues early on.
Absolutely.
Rather than when you're dealing with your important VMs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we've talked a bit about backups already, but I just want to reemphasize their importance.
Backups are your friend.
Especially with these kind of migrations, right?
Especially, having a secure backup, ideally stored externally, like on a separate USB drive or NAS.
Okay.
It's like having a safety net.
You can never have too many backups.
That's true.
Any specific resources you'd recommend for learning more about these migration methods?
Definitely check out the official Proxmox documentation.
Okay.
It's super detailed and well-written. They have guides that walk you through each step.
Perfect. We'll be sure to link those in the show notes.
Sounds good.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there's a bit more risk involved with resizing partitions.
Yeah.
Is there anything specific our listeners should be aware of when using tools like gparted?
Be careful. Double-check everything before you commit any changes.
Okay.
One wrong move, and you could lose data.
Oh, no.
But thankfully, gparted has an undo feature.
Oh, thank goodness.
It can be a real lifesaver.
Yeah, baby.
So just take your time and double-check everything.
Good advice. So migrating your Proxmox server to a larger SSD, it's totally doable.
It's not as scary as it sounds.
With a little preparation and these expert tips,
You can do it.
you can upgrade your storage and unleash the full potential of your Proxmox setup.
Exactly.
So to recap,
Okay.
you now have 3 solid options for migrating your Proxmox server to a larger SSD,
Right.
backup and restore cloning,
Yep.
and adding the new SSD at additional storage.
3 great options.
Each method has its own pros and cons.
Definitely.
And hopefully we've given you the knowledge to choose the best approach for you.
I think we have.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I have a question for you to ponder.
Okay. I'm listening.
With storage size becoming less of a constraint, what exciting new projects might you tackle with your expanded Proxmox environment?
Ooh, that's a good question.
We'll be back in the next part to explore some more advanced concepts and configurations.
I can't wait.
So stick around.
Definitely do.
All right, welcome back.
Back for more Proxmox.
So we've outlined 3 main methods for migrating your Proxmox server to a larger SSD.
Right.
Backup and restore cloning and adding a new SSD as additional storage.
The big 3.
But before you dive headfirst into any of these options,
Yeah.
it's important to consider the different types of storage that Proxmox supports.
Right. It's not just about slapping in any old SSD.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Exactly. Proxmox is really versatile when it comes to storage.
Okay.
It can work with different technologies, each with its own strengths.
Okay.
And understanding these different options can make your migration go much smoother.
So let's break down these storage options then.
Okay.
What are the most common types that our listeners should be aware of?
Well, the most straightforward is local storage.
Okay.
That's basically storage that's directly connected to your Proxmox server.
So like the SSD we've been talking about upgrading to.
Exactly. That's a prime example of local storage.
So that's like the storage that's physically inside the server itself?
Exactly.
Okay, then what about network-attached storage?
Ah.
NAS. Yes, everyone loves a good NAS.
Right. So that's storage that lives on a separate device.
Okay.
But you can access it over your network.
So if you already have a NAS setup,
Right.
you can actually use that for your Proxmox storage.
Exactly.
So I could potentially like migrate my Proxmox server to a larger SSD that's actually housed in my NAS device.
You absolutely could.
Interesting. So that adds a lot more flexibility.
It does.
Okay, cool. And then there's also LVM.
LVM.
Yeah.
Which stands for?
Logical volume management.
Okay.
That one's a bit more advanced,
A little bit, yeah.
but it gives you a ton of flexibility in managing your storage resources.
Can you demystify LVM for us a little bit? Sure. So imagine LVM as like a way of abstracting the physical storage devices from the operating system.
Okay.
So it lets you create logical volumes, which are kind of like virtual hard drives.
Okay.
And these volumes can span multiple physical disks.
Oh, okay.
So this is really useful for things like resizing partitions on the fly, combining multiple disks into a single larger volume, or even creating snapshots of your storage.
Wow. So it's like this whole other layer of storage management.
Yeah, it gives you really granular control over your storage.
Sounds pretty powerful.
It is, but it's also a bit more technical.
So maybe not something for beginners to jump into right away.
Probably not, but definitely worth exploring once you get more comfortable with Proxmox.
Okay, so our listeners should really think about which storage type best suits their needs
Absolutely.
and how it might play into their migration plan.
Right, because it's all about planning.
Planning is key.
Before you even touch a single setting or command, you need a solid plan.
You're saying we shouldn't just wing it.
I would strongly advise against that.
Uh-huh. Good advice.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are the key things our listeners should include in their migration plan?
Well, first take inventory of your current setup.
Okay.
See what you're working with.
Okay.
Identify all the virtual machines you need to migrate. Estimate how much storage space you'll need on the new SSD.
Yep.
And don't forget to factor in future growth.
Right, because you don't want to do this migration and then a year later be like, oh, shoot, I need more storage again.
Exactly. Plan ahead.
And then, based on your comfort level and your risk tolerance, choose the migration method that best aligns with your needs.
Right. We've talked about the pros and cons of each approach.
Backup and restore for safety, cloning for speed, adding a new SSD for elegant expansion.
But those are the big ones.
Then once you have your plan in place,
Yeah.
gather all the tools,
Yeah, make sure you have everything you need.
like Clonezilla and Gparted.
Right. Those are essential for cloning and resizing.
And if you're going with the backup and restore method, make sure you're familiar with Proxmox's backup and restore features.
Or set up Proxmox backup server if you're going that route.
Okay, so plan tools, what's next?
Read the Proxmox documentation.
Always read the documentation.
Seriously, it's incredibly helpful.
I know I should do it more often.
It can save you a lot of headaches.
Okay, we'll link to the documentation in the show notes for sure.
Good idea.
Now let's talk about some common pitfalls to avoid during the migration process.
Ah, yes, the things that can trip you up.
I'm sure you've seen your fair share of migration mishaps over the years.
Oh, definitely. And honestly, most of them come down to not being prepared.
Okay.
The most common mistake is not backing up your data before you start.
Yeah, that's like rule number 1 of any tech project.
Back up your data.
Always back up.
Another common pitfall is not double-checking your storage configuration settings.
Okay.
Especially when adding a new SSD, make sure everything is formatted correctly
Right.
and your mount points are set up properly.
Now points.
Yeah, that's how your operating system knows where to find your storage devices.
So it's like giving your storage a specific address that the system can use to access it.
Exactly.
Okay. And of course, we have to mention the classic mistake of not testing your migration plan on a non-essential VM first.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
So important to do a test run.
It's like a dress rehearsal for your data.
So testing backups, double-checking configurations, these are the golden rules of a smooth Proxmox migration.
Absolutely follow those rules and you'll be fine.
Now, let's say you've successfully migrated your Proxmox server to that shiny new, larger SSD.
Okay.
You might think you're done.
You're not.
There's one more crucial step.
Optimization.
Optimization. Okay, so we're not just done once the data is moved over.
Right. You want to make sure everything's running smoothly.
So what kind of optimization are we talking about?
Well, one area to focus on is storage I/O optimization.
Storage I/O.
Yeah, I/O stands for input-output,
Okay.
and it refers to the way your server reads and writes data to its storage devices.
So we're talking about making sure the data flow between the server and the SSD is as smooth as possible.
Exactly. You want to make sure there are no bottlenecks.
Proxmox offers various settings that can impact I/O performance, right?
Right, like the I/O scheduler.
The I/O scheduler.
Yeah, think of it as a traffic cop that manages the flow of data to your storage devices.
So choosing the right I/O scheduler can really speed things up.
It can make a big difference.
Okay, and what about cache settings?
Ah, cache. That's a good one.
What's cache?
Cache is like a temporary storage area
Okay.
that holds frequently accessed data.
Okay.
So Proxmox doesn't have to go back to the physical SSD every time it needs that data.
So by optimizing the cache, we can speed things up even more.
Exactly, because you're reducing the number of times the system has to access the physical drive.
It's like having a shortcut for your data.
That's a good way to think about it.
And there are a lot of nuances to these settings, and we won't go into all the details here.
Right.
But the key takeaway is that after you migrate, it's worth exploring these optimization options
Definitely.
to get the most out of your new storage setup.
You want to make sure you're squeezing every drop of performance out of that new SSD.
All right, so we've covered local storage, NAS LVM.
The basics.
Now, if you really want to get into the weeds of Proxmox storage,
Yes, the advanced stuff.
there's some really interesting configurations you can explore.
Like Ceph.
Ceph.
Yeah, it's a distributed storage system designed for high availability and scalability,
Okay.
meaning you can manage massive amounts of storage across multiple Proxmox servers.
So if you're running a Proxmox cluster,
Right, where you have multiple Proxmox servers working together.
then Ceph could be a game changer.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
a powerful tool for that kind of environment.
Okay, and then there's also GlusterFS.
GlusterFS, another great option.
It's similar to Ceph in terms of functionality.
Yeah, it's another distributed file system that offers scalability and reliability.
So both Ceph and GlusterFS are good options for those who need, like, really serious storage solutions.
Yeah, for enterprise-grade setups.
But these are more advanced setups, right?
Definitely, you need a good understanding of how they work before you jump in.
So do your research.
Always do your research.
Now, we can't talk about Proxmox storage without mentioning the cloud,
The final frontier.
right? So there are options like Amazon S3 or Google Cloud Storage
Right.
for integrating cloud storage into your Proxmox environment.
Exactly.
So you could actually store your Proxmox virtual machines in the cloud.
You could.
That's pretty amazing.
It opens up a lot of possibilities.
Like for backups and disaster recovery.
Right, and even geographically distributed Proxmox deployments.
So your Proxmox setup could literally span the globe.
It could?
That's wild. So
Yes.
these advanced configurations really take things to a whole new level.
They do, but they also come with added complexity.
So again, do your research before you dive in.
Definitely.
Now, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder.
Okay, shoot.
With all these storage options and migration methods at our disposal, how can we leverage these tools to create really resilient and future-proof Proxmox environments?
That's the million-dollar question.
We'll be back in the next part to explore some answers to this question
That's good.
and wrap up our deep dive into the world of Proxmox migration.
I'm looking forward to it.
All right, welcome back to our Proxmox migration deep dive.
It's the final countdown.
So we've walked you through the nuts and bolts of migrating to a larger SSD.
Yeah, from backup and restore to cloning, we've covered a lot.
We even talked about some pretty advanced configurations like Ceph.
Ceph GlusterFS Cloud Storage.
But there's one more crucial piece of the puzzle we need to address.
Oh, really? What's that?
It's the strategic side of things.
Ah, the big picture.
We need to shift our mindset
Okay, so...
from simply reacting to storage constraints
Right.
to being proactive and planning for the future.
I like that being proactive is always better than being reactive.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So how do we adopt this proactive mindset when it comes to our Proxmox setup?
Monitoring is key. You got to keep a close eye on your storage utilization trends.
So basically knowing how your storage is being used.
Exactly. Proxmox has some great built-in monitoring tools that can help you visualize how your storage is being used over time.
Okay.
And you can set up alerts.
Oh, that's smart.
So you get notified when your storage usage hits a certain threshold.
So you're not caught off guard.
Exactly. It's all about being aware and anticipating your needs.
And what about capacity planning?
Capacity planning, that's another big one.
What is that?
It's all about forecasting your future storage needs
Okay.
based on your anticipated growth.
So like how much data you expect to generate in the coming months or years?
Right. You need to consider things like how many VMs you plan to run,
Hmm.
what kind of applications they'll be hosting, how fast you expect your data to grow.
So it's like creating a roadmap for your storage infrastructure.
Exactly, a roadmap that ensures you can handle future demands.
And this roadmap should be something you revisit regularly, right?
Oh, absolutely. Things change, new projects come up.
Your storage needs are always evolving.
Exactly. It's not a one and done kind of thing.
Speaking of things changing and unexpected events,
Uh-oh. What are you thinking?
we need to talk about disaster recovery.
Ah, yes. The dreaded what-if scenario.
No matter how well we plan, things can still go wrong.
Hard drives can fail, servers can crash.
It's like Murphy's Law.
Right. So you need a solid disaster recovery plan.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what are the essential elements of a good disaster recovery plan?
Well, we've mentioned it a few times already, but backups.
Backups, backups, backups.
They're your insurance policy against data loss.
And it's not just about having one backup, right?
No, ideally you want multiple backups.
Redundancy.
Exactly, multiple backups stored in different locations.
Okay, so one backup on an external drive, maybe another in the cloud,
That's a great strategy.
just to be extra safe.
You can never be too careful.
And once you have those backups in place, you need to test them.
Yes, test your disaster recovery plan regularly.
It's not enough to just have it written down somewhere.
Right, you need to actually practice restoring your Proxmox environment.
So you know it works when you need it.
Exactly. And you can identify any potential issues before a real disaster strikes.
Okay, so proactive planning, disaster recovery. What else do we need to consider?
Security.
Yes, security, can't forget about that.
It's crucial. You can have the best infrastructure in the world.
But if it's not secure?
It's all for nothing.
So how do we go about securing our Proxmox environment?
It starts with the basics.
Okay.
Keep Proxmox up to date.
Oh, those updates.
New security vulnerabilities are found all the time.
So stay on top of those updates, patch those vulnerabilities.
And secure access to your Proxmox web interface.
Okay.
Use strong passwords, implement two-factor authentication.
No more password 123.
Definitely not. And don't forget about network security.
Okay.
Make sure you have a firewall in place.
Right.
And consider using an intrusion detection system.
So it's all about layers of security.
Exactly. A multi-layered approach is the best way to protect your Proxmox server.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We really have.
The technical aspects of migrating to a larger SSD, proactive planning, disaster recovery, security.
We've hit all the major points.
Any final words of wisdom for our listeners as they embark on their Proxmox journey?
Remember, this is a constantly evolving field.
Things change quickly.
So stay curious, embrace new knowledge, and don't be afraid to experiment.
That's great advice. The world of Proxmox is full of possibilities.
It really is.
And the key is to keep learning and exploring.
And you're not alone in this journey.
Right.
There's a huge community of Proxmox users out there.
Always happy to help.
So go forth, experiment, and share your discoveries.
That's the beauty of open source.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us on this Proxmox deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you found it informative and empowering.
I hope so too.
Until next time, keep learning, keep experimenting.
And keep pushing the limits of what's possible with Proxmox.
We'll see you next time.